For those of you that may well have forgotten, my name is Woodson. And if you're visiting, what that means is that this class was supposed to have started 2 weeks ago, and I have been missing in action. Feeling a lot better today, still a little shaky, but we'll do it. I want to say a public thank you to Forrest for taking over. And both weeks it was really the last minute. The cough hit me on a Saturday, so Saturday afternoon I called and Forrest took over. I got to feeling a little better and thought I could do it, and then late last week I kind of got worse again, so I called Forrest again on a Saturday afternoon. It's not easy to be prepared to teach a class in one of the small rooms and then come out here and do it, because it's really a totally different atmosphere. So I appreciate that. Also appreciate Brother Steve Meadows, who's the technical support for all of this. He's going to be doing some slides and things and handing out handouts this morning. He's handing out a timeline that is more for your personal study than it will be for this. It's kind of a hard to use timeline, but it has a lot of material in there, and I like that because it relates a lot of the events in the Bible to things that are going on outside, not necessarily in relation to Bible, but it just shows what relates civilization, if you will, to some Bible events. So, we are going to be doing a review of the Old Testament. Now, the good news is I will not run out of material. The bad news is I may well run out of prepared material. So, if you see me doing that, just raise your hand and help out a little bit. Make some comments. They're always appreciated. And as we go through some of this, we certainly can't talk about everything. So I will make a decision of how we're going to proceed. But if you see something that you think is important that I've left out, please raise your hand. If you disagree with something I say, raise your hand. That's fine with me. So with that, I'd like to make just a comment about how we got the Old Testament. The original language was Hebrew. Primarily, there was a little bit in Aramaic, but primarily it was Hebrew. And it was translated very early into Greek. And Greek really became the prevalent language that was used in the early days of Christianity, primarily because Hebrew became a dead language. It literally, by people, was not either written or spoken. And that happened because of all of the problems that came along with being a Jew, and we're going to take a look this morning and maybe next week about some of those issues. How often the Hebrew people were taken captive, they had foreign rulers, they were taken into captivity, and all of these things made other languages become prevalent, so that Hebrew became a dead language. And it's interesting to note that it is the only dead language that was ever revived. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a movement by one group of people to revive the written language, and another group that was interested in making Hebrew a spoken language. And it is now the official language of Israel, spoken by some 9 to 10 million people around the world. And one of the things that the people that were working on the written language was doing, they were reconstructing the Bible in Hebrew. The earliest manuscript that they had to work with was 900 AD. And yet when they did all they could do, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 brought the earliest known writing back to the time of Christ. There was very, very little difference between the Dead Sea Scrolls and what the people had come up with as reviving the language. That's a phenomenal story, how it was preserved so perfectly through all of that time. Okay, do we have an echo? Have I got the microphone in the wrong place? I'm sorry. How's that? Now I just need to fasten it there. Okay, better? I will be trying to do this in chronological order, and we'll start at creation, and we'll go through creation, the patriarchs, Exodus, and right on through. We'll take some side trips through all of that, so it won't be all entirely in perfectly chronological order. But in the beginning, God created. Simple. Yet we find all kinds of ways to argue that. In the beginning, God created. He created something from nothing. He lists the days in sequence, beginning with light and dark, all the way up to day 6, he created man. On day 7, he rested. That rest becomes the basis for one of the 10 commandments. And it's kind of interesting to look at this. Let's go to Exodus 31:14. You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. Work shall be done for 6 days, but the 7th is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Now the Jews get into all kinds of twists and turns over trying to define work. But if you look at this, if I were a Jew, I'd want to know what constituted work. You look at the things that they came up with on defining work, and it seems like a lot of it was more related to how you could do what you wanted to do without breaking the law. You could only walk so far on the Sabbath day, but you could set up homes or places that would extend that distance for a ways. They may have overdone it, but if you put yourself in the place of a Jew and you look at this, death is the penalty for working, I'd sure want to know what constituted work. Okay. I want to skip to the Garden of Eden now. Let's look at Genesis 2, chapter 9. And we'll begin the reading in verse 8. The Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and therefore he put the man who he had formed. And out of the ground the Lord God made every tree grow that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There were two trees there. One, they were told, don't eat. And we know the story, how the serpent deceived Eve. She ate of that tree that they were not supposed to eat, the tree of knowledge, good and evil. She convinced Adam to eat of that. Sin came into the world through that tree. They were all punished. The serpent had a punishment, man had a punishment, woman had a punishment. But I want to take a look at that. We think about that a lot. But what about the other tree? The tree of life. Let's go to 2:17. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. That's the first one. Let's go to 3:24. So he drove out the man, and he placed cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden, and a flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. Man was prohibited from partaking of the tree of life. Had cherubim there to guard the way. Kind of a frightening thought. We don't talk about the tree of life that much, but let's look at Revelation 2:7. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give to eat from the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. We now can get to that tree of life. We now have access to it. We have access to the tree of life. Let's go to Revelation 22. This is one of the last visions of John, and it's really kind of a close of the Bible. It's very near the end. 22:1. And he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb. In the middle of its street, and on either side of the river, was the tree of life, which bore 12 fruits, each tree yielding its fruit every month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations, and there shall be no more curse. That curse prohibiting us from entering that garden and partaking of that tree of life is over. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that the Bible in its entirety, beginning in Genesis, we're barred from it, and in Revelation, it's available. The Bible tells us how we get there, how we enter that garden, and how we partake of the tree of life. There's also a passage in Ezekiel that speaks to this. I think it's worthwhile to look at it. And one of the things I'm going to try to do in this class is take some sojourns into prophecy and look at some of the prophecies in the Old Testament that are really pertinent and relevant. Okay, Ezekiel chapter 47. This vision is given to Ezekiel, and it occurs after the people are released from Babylonian captivity. They are coming back into the land, and this is some things that Ezekiel sees that's going to happen. Then he brought me back, 47:1, then he brought me back to the door of the temple, and there was water flowing from under the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the front of the temple faced east. The water was flowing from under the right side of the temple, south of the altar. Now, the direction east is important here because when the Babylonians destroyed the temple, the glory of God left the temple from the east door. And we see at the beginning of this vision, if you want to go back and look at it, it's in chapter 43, Ezekiel has seen the glory of God returning to the temple through the east door. So this water that we're going to see coming out of the temple is coming from the throne of God, just like the water that John saw coming from God and the Lamb. Now, we're not going to see the phrase tree of life here in Ezekiel, but we're going to see an almost identical vision to what John saw. He brought me out by the way of the north gate and led me around on the outside of the outer gateway that faces east, and there was water running out on the right side. Now, the next few verses talk about how quickly this water increases in volume. He goes a short distance and measures it, and it's a lot deeper, and on and on and on. Skip down to verse 7. When I returned, there along the bank of the river were very many trees on one side on the other, and he said to me, this water flows toward the eastern region, goes down into the valley, and enters the sea. When it reaches the sea, its waters are healed. The word picture is that this water leaves the temple in Jerusalem, flows into the Dead Sea. This water is powerful enough to heal the Dead Sea. And it shall be that every living thing that moves wherever the rivers go will live. There will be a very great multitude of fish because these waters go there, for they will be healed. And everything will live wherever the river goes. It shall be that fishermen will stand by it from En-Gedi to En-Eglaim, and they will be places for spreading their nets. Their fish will be of the same kinds as the fish of the great sea, exceedingly many. The Dead Sea will become as productive in terms of life and fish as the Mediterranean. But its swamps and marshes will not be healed. They will be given over to salt. Along the bank of the river, on this side and that, will grow all kinds of trees used for food. Their leaves will not wither, and their fruit will not fail. Very much like the vision that John saw in Revelation. You have these trees that will bear fruit every month, and the leaves are for the healing of nations. They will bear fruit every month because their water flows from the sanctuary. Their fruit will be for food and their leaves for medicine. Can you think of a New Testament example of water that is powerful enough to bring the dead to life? Sound a little like baptism? Buried to rise in newness of life. This is a fantastic, there's a lot of points that we can make here about how much water, how deep, how quick. I'll leave that to you to think about, but this is a fantastic prophecy relating to access to that tree of life. It's sometimes I think we're scared of it because it's not explained. Ezekiel, a lot of Ezekiel is in symbolic language. It's hard to understand, and we're literally not told very often about precisely what the symbolism means. But we can look around and see if there's something similar that is fulfilled. I think this is a great prophecy about how we access that tree of life. Okay, any questions? Thoughts, ideas? Jack? Well, let's see. Go ahead.
I've got a comment. Atheists and non-believers will use everything they can about the Bible to dispute what you tell them. I remember hearing Madeline O'Hare on radio saying that Adam and Eve were forbidden to eat from the tree of knowledge, and that's it. She didn't say knowledge of good and evil. So she put her own interpretation of that. But she also said that belief is faith and faith is religion, which is true. I mean, that's almost an exact quote from Hebrews 11:1. For faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. But yet in our schools, the things that are not seen is taught as science, like the Big Bang Theory and everything.
Yeah. Okay.
I was just going to mention the tree of life is also mentioned in Revelation 22:14, which you're probably aware of, but it says, "Blessed are those who wash their robes," and I think the King James says, "who keep the commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life and may enter by the gates into the city."
Yeah.
That's a great verse.
Yeah. We don't think about the tree of life all that much. We don't talk about it. But it is a pretty interesting and useful concept. Anything else? I appreciate those comments because doing a review, there's always some things you hit the high points and sometimes you don't get to all of the details. So please sing out. Okay, anything else? Okay, after this, man is left to toil in the garden. It's not long until man becomes sinful, needs to be cleansed and taught a lesson. Noah's flood destroys everything except for Noah's family. We see the first murder in the Bible, Cain and Abel. We see that pride leads the people to combine knowledge and workload or work activities, and they're trying to build this, what we call the Tower of Babel. God confuses the language, and people spread out. Probably several centuries pass until we get to the time of Abraham. And Stephen, if we could have the slide now. Can we bring it down to there we go. Abraham is going to leave from Ur. He's going to get a message from God that he is to leave and go to the land that's going to be promised to him. His first stop, he goes up the Euphrates River to Haran. He stays there for a while, then he comes on down and enters the promised land, which is right over here. I'll talk a little bit about just what is going on in the world. At this time, there are two major centers of culture or civilization. One is the Babylonia, Mesopotamia area here. And the color doesn't come out real well on this slide, but this crescent that begins here at the Persian Gulf follows the Tigris and Euphrates River back down to the Promised Land, to Canaan, is called the Fertile Crescent. That is the access that people have in going from Mesopotamia down to Egypt, is the other great center of civilization. Both of those had been well advanced by the time of Abraham. That archaeology tells us that those are two very, very ancient centers of civilization. Abraham goes into the land. There is a famine. He goes to Egypt. He stays there and has some adventures. And he comes back, and he and Lot, his nephew, realize that they have too much livestock for the land that they're trying to settle. So Abraham gives Lot the choice. And Lot chooses the area along the Jordan River. It's the fertile land. It's the most well-watered land. Lot decides to make his home in Sodom. Sodom is believed to be the very southern edge of the Dead Sea. And I want to pick up a reading in Genesis chapter, I think it's 14. Lost my microphone again. And it came to pass, this is chapter 14, verse 1. And it came to pass in the days of Amphraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations. We're not told exactly where these kings were from. We can make some guesses when we get to the end of this. But they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zorah. So what has happened here is that these first kings have conquered the land around the Dead Sea. We'll call that Canaanites for the time being. The kings around the Dead Sea had paid tribute to Chedorlaomer and his allies for 12 years. They rebel. They decide they're not going to pay tribute any longer. Chedorlaomer and his allies come back to punish them for their rebellion. They actually don't go to the Dead Sea first. They kind of go around the Dead Sea and conquer and a lot of other cities. Verse 4, 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and the 13th year they rebelled. Then the next few verses talk about them coming in. The 5 kings of the Dead Sea area come out and attack Chedorlaomer and his allies. And in verse 11, then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. So Lot is taken captive. These people depart toward their homeland, and they're taking Lot with them. Someone comes to Abraham, who had escaped, and told Abram, the Hebrew, the first time the word Hebrew has been used in the Bible, that what had happened. Verse 14, now when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house and went in pursuit as far as Dan. First thing of interest is that how quickly Abraham has come up with this much material things. 318 trained servants born in his house. It hasn't been all that many years since he left Ur, went to Haran, he spent some time in Egypt. But he has been blessed greatly every place he's gone. 318 men. He divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobab, which is north of Damascus. Now that's the clue that we have to tell us where these people were from. Where is Damascus? It's in the Fertile Crescent. Damascus is considered by most archaeologists as the oldest continuously occupied city in the world. We would know this as Syria today, but it is part of the greater Mesopotamian and Babylonian and Persian culture. The point is, and we're going to get into this, that the Mesopotamians had been fighting the Canaanites even before the time of Abraham. Now we're going to see this as we go through the history of the people in spades. Assyria, Nineveh, Babylonians, Medes and Persians, all are culturally from the same people as these people here that attacked in Genesis chapter 14. That battle, that fight has been going on for years. Why? We'll think about that as we go through. I want to take a little bit of a detour here and look at the international battles that the Israelite people are going to face. A couple of reasons. Number one, I want to make sure that we get through that. And I'm afraid if we stay strictly chronological, that we won't get that finished. But I want to make sure that we go through that, because that framework of captivity, occupation, shapes so much of the Israelite history. And if we kind of get an idea of what's going on and what's happened, it'll make a lot more sense as we're going back through the details. I hope that makes sense. As we look through the patriarchal period, we don't really see much in the way of battles of any kind. A little bit over water rights, maybe in some land, but there's not any real international conflicts that occur during the patriarchal period. Certainly, in the time that they're in captivity, there's not any international events. As they leave during the Exodus, they have one battle with the Amalekites even before they get to Sinai. The battles really start as they're nearing the final push into the Promised Land. And once they get there, there is a lot of battles that occur, but they're mostly with the people that are already in that Promised Land. We see that when Joshua first takes the people into the land, Jericho. That type of conflict continues through the judges, through the kings. By the time we get to David, the Jewish people have reached their zenith in land that is occupied, that they control, they govern. Just a quick, and please don't take this as absolute numbers, but if you look at a map of land that they control during the time of David, it's probably north to south, somewhere around 300 miles, and maybe an average width of 75 miles. A little over between 20 and 25,000 square miles is the amount of land that they control during the time of David and Solomon. Okay, I want to hand out, Steve, he's handing out a more detailed timeline and one that's easier to use. When Solomon dies, immediately following, there's a group of people that do not want to continue to follow a leader that is going to continue Solomon's activities. Those people in the northern part decide that they would be better off separating and not being subject to Solomon's sons as successor. So in 931, the kingdom divides into Israel and Judah. So out of that 20+ thousand square miles that they had under David, that number is cut way in half. So we're looking at, I've seen numbers as low as 6,000 square miles that it was controlled by Judah. Be a little bit more if you count the Transjordan area, that area east of the Jordan River, maybe could be up to 10,000 miles. The point is that Judah is a very, very tiny area. So why is it subject to such turmoil? 931 BC, the kingdom divides into Israel and Judah. Very much weaker. By the year 722, the northern kingdom has been taken over by Assyria. I think we pointed that out earlier, but Assyria is on the Tigris River. I didn't do that, did I? Nineveh, Assyria. It's up the Tigris River. They are a group of people that are vicious, mean, vindictive, but they don't deport people very much. They leave the Israelites in place, but they bring their own people in, and they're very much subjected to Assyrian rule. The key character that we see in Assyrian military activity is by the name of Sennacherib. And if you want to read about that, I hope we get to it as we come back and do this in detail. 2 Kings 19 and 2 Chronicles 32. Sennacherib tries to take Jerusalem and conquer all of the land. God intervenes. Much of his army is destroyed one night, so they retreat, and they never conquer the southern kingdom. Things stay pretty much that same way until, if you look at the very right-hand end of that handout that you've got, temple destroyed, Babylonian captivity, lasts 70 years. And that's in the year 587. Nebuchadnezzar comes in, destroys the temple, takes many of the furnishings back to Babylon. This captivity is to last for 70 years. The books that detail this captivity are Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Daniel. The first Persian king that they come in, they defeat the Babylonians. The first Persian king is named Cyrus. We're running out of time, so if you want to look it up, in Ezra chapter 1, beginning at the first verse, it details it details the king Cyrus releasing the captives that were still living in Babylon. Now, one of the really interesting prophecies related to that, look at Isaiah on your timeline. Isaiah lives and works in the 725 to 687 time frame. Isaiah 44, verse 28 through 45:1 details who is going to release the captivities or the captives. By name, he lists the first king of Persia, Cyrus, is going to be the one. That's 150 years before the event. Just amazing. Much of the remaining part of the Bible, of the Old Testament, is related to the people coming back, rebuilding the temple. The furnishings come back, at least most of them, the ones that have not been destroyed. And the Old Testament ends at that point with the exception of prophecy. If we look at Daniel, if you remember the statue in Daniel, okay, Babylon, Medes and Persians, that's where the Old Testament ends in terms of real time. Greek and Roman. There are some fascinating areas related to the Greeks. Go to Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11, verse 5. My Bible has the headline, Warring Kings of North and South. Warring Kings of North and South. What has happened here, and in the context, Alexander the Great has conquered the entire area. One of the fascinating things to think about is, why did he not destroy Jerusalem like he did so many of the other areas? Legend has it that as he was coming through, he met with the high priest. The high priest showed him the book of Daniel and told him that he was the man that was leading this group that was coming in, that he was a part of the Bible. So he relented and did nothing to destroy or damage the temple or Jerusalem itself. That's the good news. The bad news is that he died shortly. He was in Egypt. He died. His kingdom was divided among his 4 generals, 2 of which are important here, the king of the north and the king of the south. We would know them as Egypt and the Syrians. They use the name here, Seleucids and Ptolemies. Ptolemies are Egyptians, Seleucids are the Syrians. And if you read verses 5, say through 14, you will find at least 6 times that these armies are fighting against each other. They want control. Egypt is the big prize here. They both want control of Egypt because of the water, the land, the richness. 6 times an invading army either fights a battle near Jerusalem or is passing through trying to get to the other side. Let me read you, we're going to be out of time, and probably the simplest way to do this is read a note. Antiochus III, king of Syria, expanded the boundaries of the Seleucid kingdom in numerous battles with the Ptolemies. In 221 BC, he captured part of Palestine, only to lose most of it. In 217 BC, returning in 2001, he finally defeated the Ptolemies with the aid and support of the Jews. Palestine enjoyed freedom from Egyptian domination until 175 BC, when a new leader, Antiochus IV, became king of Syria. His oppression of the Jews led to the Maccabean revolt of 167 BC and eventual Jewish autonomy in 164. That Maccabean revolt in 164 is the only time after the Assyrian conquering of the land that the Jews had governmental autonomy. And that only lasted a few months until the Romans came in and did away with that. The point of all this is that there has long been battles between this area and this area. The way to get from those 2 areas is through here. There have been constant battles for centuries of that. The Jews, during the time of the kings, got into trouble a few times because they would attempt to make a peace treaty between one or the other sides, especially the Babylonians. They wanted to make a peace treaty with Egypt to protect themselves against Babylonian invasion. God didn't approve. God wanted them to rely on Him rather than their own invasions. So I think with all of this going on, you can see how, number one, Hebrew became a lost language. They were primarily Greek-speaking for a long time. Then other languages began to come in. All right. We'll take up there next week.